Hi students, we're here for Government Finance and the Economic Outlook Part 2. So let's finish up this lecture, but let's just take a minute to review what we've covered last part. So we talked about two categories of government spending, and remember these were mandatory spending and discretionary spending. Remember, mandatory, just as the name suggests, is mandated by law. These are benefit programs that have eligibility rules. So if you're eligible, you have to be paid or you have to be allowed to participate in whatever benefit. And there are benefit formulas that say how much you'll get. So we've talked about Social Security, we've talked about Medicare, we've talked about Medicaid, and so Congress doesn't play a role in these types of expenditures, right? They might be able to change the rules a little bit. We talked about the Social Security age for full benefits moving from 65 to 67, and this was a way to contain some costs and get down the total expenditures for Social Security, but Congress can't simply scrap the program. On the other side, we talked about discretionary expenditures, and these are the types of spending that government does control. So Congress does have to get together every year and come up with an annual budget. And we talked about the idea that if they can't agree on a budget, then we can have a government shutdown. So we talked a little bit about that idea and what might happen in a government shutdown. We also acknowledge there's one more expense. So when we think about government spending, we have these two categories, but there's one other very important expense, and that is net interest. What are we talking about with net interest? Well, we're talking about the net expense from government taking loans. So what are we talking about? Primarily comprised of the loans from the debt that our government has, and they have to pay those people that have loaned money with interest, right? So we have to pay interest just like you and I, if we take out a loan for a house or a loan for a car, have to pay interest. And this is a real expense of government. So we have to add that into the mix. Let's explain this idea a little bit better because it's net interest. So you might be wondering, why not just call it interest? Why do we call it net interest? I'll try to explain that better. But first, let's look at the definition. It's defined as the government's interest payments on debt that's held by the public. So we're talking about debt held by the public, not the intragovernmental debt because they're paying interest to themselves, but interest payments on debt held by the public offset by interest income the government receives. All right, so make sure you're clear. There's two components. We have the interest that has to be paid on the debt, but then the second part of the statement says the interest that government receives. So net interest is the payment on the debt, the interest you have to pay on the debt, and then minus the interest that government actually receives. So let's go over that a little bit better. We've actually discussed this idea in a previous lecture, so this is probably review. But remember, the federal government has to have interest that they pay on loans from the public, right? People are basically making loans to the federal government, and in exchange, they're getting interest. So when investors buy government instruments, and we've been using the example of bonds, they get paid with interest, right? So this is a real expense for the government, and as we said, it has to be added in to our federal government expenses. So they have to pay interest on the debt. Here's the other part of it. Government also makes some interest. We have to remember that government itself is investing in its own instruments, right? If we have Social Security with a surplus and then they invest in treasury bonds, they make interest, well, we have to offset that. So we need to add these two things together when government has to pay interest and when government receives interest. So basically, net interest is the interest paid. That's going to be the interest paid to those investors who hold bonds, right? Who invest in government bonds, but then subtract off the interest that is earned. So there you have it. We're basically saying In some cases, the government is spending money when they pay interest to investors, but in other times, when they're investing themselves, they actually earn some interest. So the net interest is the difference between the two. Now, you can probably figure out which is bigger, the interest paid by government or the interest earned by government. Well, clearly it's the interest paid by government. So the net interest is always going to be some positive number. They don't earn so much interest that it cancels out the interest that they have to pay. That's why we call it net interest. We're not going to make a really big deal about that, but you're going to see it's referred to as net interest, and that's why. What this means, folks, is that if we want to think about total government spending, there's actually not just two components, but three components. So we have mandatory spending, right? Those things governed by law and eligibility rules. We have discretionary spending, those things that Congress controls through the budgetary process they go through every year. And then we have net interest, the net amount of money that has to be paid on the debt. So these are the three components of our government expenditures, which remember also can be called government outlays, government spending. So expenditures, outlays, spending, they are all the same thing. But if we want to look at total government outlays, we need to add these three things together. Let's take a look. This is fiscal year 2023, and I'm highlighting that because then we're going to look also over time. This is the breakdown of the three categories. So you see in the darker blue, mandatory expenditures of 63%, discretionary of 30%, and then the net interest of 8%. So guys, on the right, I've got some questions. Where does the bulk of the money go? Well, the bulk of the money is going to mandatory expenditures, right? And those mandatory expenditures, as we've said over and over, are governed by law and eligibility rules. So containing those costs is going to be hard. And that's a problem because this is a really big share of government spending. So guys, as Social Security gets more and more and more expensive, what's going to happen to that mandatory component? It might get bigger and bigger and bigger. Now, the second question says, is net interest a large share of government spending? Well, net interest here is 8%. That's not huge like mandatory expenditures, right? But it's not small either. We want to keep that in mind. All right, so our clear takeaway here is that the bulk of the money goes to mandatory, some goes to discretionary, and then a small portion goes to our net interest. But this is just a snapshot of 2023, and we can look historically what it looked like in the past, and we can also look at what is it projected in the future. So let's do that. Let's take a look. First, let's look historically. Again, remember, when I present you with a graph, you need to look at the axes so you know exactly what's being presented. What you see here is we're looking at years 1962 through 2019. Had a little trouble finding something that was more recent, but guys, this gives us a pretty clear and obvious trend. And then on the vertical axis, we're looking at share of the total. All right. So the first thing, let's look at the middle category, mandatory. What trends do we see here, guys? What's happening to the proportion of each year's spending that's going to mandatory expenditures? Hopefully you see it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So mandatory expenditures are kind of ballooning, right? And that's in part to these entitlement programs that are getting bigger and bigger and more expensive. So if mandatory expenditures are getting bigger and bigger, what's happening to discretionary spending? Well, you agree, discretionary spending is getting smaller and smaller, and that makes sense, right? If one gets bigger, the other has to get smaller as a share of the pie, right? If you think about a pie and you give a bigger piece to mandatory spending, then the share that goes to discretionary spending is going to have to get smaller. So over time, mandatory expenditures have really ballooned, and that's crowding out discretionary expenditures, right? There's only so much money we can spend. And then, of course, you see net interest is interesting because there are times where net interest has been a lot bigger in terms of the share of the pie, probably because of interest rates and maybe because of the amount of debt we've taken out during certain periods of time. So key takeaway, mandatory is getting bigger as a share, discretionary is getting smaller as a share, and then net interest is kind of a little wishy-washy, bigger, smaller, bigger, smaller. We'll talk more about that. Here's another graphic that does something similar, but what we're doing here is just comparing 3 years. We're looking at a snapshot for 1973, so that's going to tell us our history. 2023, that's current at the time of me recording this, and then 2053 forecasted into the future. But let's, as I said in the note on the right in yellow, let's divide this out and just make some pairwise comparisons. But before we do that, make sure you see what's being presented. Again, we're looking at basically pie charts, but presented in a slightly different way. The blue is the net interest, the darker blue. The lighter blue is mandatory expenditures, and the gray is discretionary. So let's start by looking at 1973 versus 2023. And what do we see here? What would be the key takeaways if you look at 2023 as I record this lecture versus a good few decades ago, right? 50 years before that, what are we seeing? Again, same thing. Mandatory expenditures are getting bigger. We went from 40% of total federal spending to 63% of total federal spending. But that's going to crowd out discretionary spending, right? The more you spend on mandatory, the less you have to spend on discretionary. So discretionary spending has been shrinking. And then interest, because our debt's getting bigger, is starting to take up a larger and larger share. All right, so that's kind of looking backwards from 50 years ago to today as I record this. Now let's look going forward. This, of course, is going to be based on our forecasting. Again, we've talked about that there are people who are paid to be able to do this kind of forecasting. It's highly mathematical, but we can assume that they're saying this is what things are going to look like if we don't change anything. So again, we're assuming we're not getting rid of Social Security or drastically reforming it. We're not, changing the way we handle our debt. We're not changing discretionary programming, that kind of thing. All right. So what we're saying here is that if we forecast over time, what expense is really starting to go up? Net interest. Our net interest on our debt is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. Well, that makes sense because our debt is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And as our net interest expense goes up, because we have to pay that, right? We can't just say, we're not going to pay our interest this year because then we're going to be in default and then we have a bad credit rating and we don't want that. That's a disaster. So where does this money come from? Well, it's going to have to come from decreased mandatory expenditures and, of course, decreased discretionary expenditures. But we do still see that mandatory component is still really, really high. So this is a problem. What's the takeaway? Same thing we've already said from the previous slides. Our mandatory expenditures are ballooning, and that's crowding out discretionary expenditures, right? The more we spend on mandatory, the less we have to spend on discretionary. But this highlights the issue of debt net interest a little bit better, that we're going to have higher net interest to pay. And we got to get that money from somewhere. We cannot default on our payments on our debt, right? This is something that we already have kind of talked about, but part of the problem here, kind of a big issue, is spending versus revenues. So this kind of ties it all the way back to part 1 of this lecture, right? When we talked about spending and revenues. So this is data from 2017. So to the left is actual data based on what our government actually did, and everything else to the right is projected. But again, people do this. So we're saying, look, if we don't make big structural changes in tax codes, if we don't make big structural changes in our spending, these are the trends. Look what's happening, guys. Well, we're already, for years, have been in a situation where spending is greater than revenue. We already know that, right? We know that we generally run a deficit. But what's happening in the future to the size of the deficit? The size of the deficit's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And so while we already know we're operating in deficit times, deficit spending, which adds to our national debt, over your lifetime, again, I'll be dead by then most likely, but, well, or getting close to it, I'll be old, but you guys are going to be in your working prime, and you're going to have bigger and bigger and bigger deficits to deal with. So again, we already understand this idea, but I want to connect the dots. These are all connected issues. We need to ask the question, is this sustainable? Is this situation sustainable? It's not a surprise. We've been talking about the ballooning entitlement programs for a long time. So we have to go back to this idea that, look, hey, our entitlement programs like Social Security and Medicare are ballooning. And there's not an end in sight anytime soon, right? Baby boomers aren't super old at this point. Our demographics suggest that we're going to have this bubble for quite a while. So what are we going to do about these entitlement programs? That's got to be addressed. We're going to be talking about this later, but Social Security is facing insolvency. We've been talking about for a long time that there's a lot of financial stress on Social Security because, again, it's a mandatory expenditure governed by law, and the rules are set by law, and we have more and more people to support. So we'll talk more about the stress about Social Security and what the real fiscal situation looks like, but we know that Social Security is a problem, and we know that there's not an end in sight, that our baby boomers aren't that old. So this is not something we can just put off and have the population demographics work out in a few years to our advantage, because that elderly population is continuing to grow. It's growing and growing. It's not shrinking right now. It's not shrinking in 10 years. It's not shrinking in 20 years. We know that our debt situation is growing. We know that, and the previous graph confirms, right, that our deficits are going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And as our deficits get bigger and bigger and bigger, the debt gets bigger and bigger. But one thing that we've kind of added to the story is that interest expense, right, that net interest expense becomes larger and larger as a percent of our government spending each year. So if it's going to start taking up a larger and larger share of the pie, well, that money has to come from somewhere. And that means we have to decrease discretionary and mandatory spending. You might be asking, what can we do here? What can we do? Because this is of concern, right? We have two options, and actually probably three options. We could cut spending, right? We can cut spending, and that might apply to Social Security as well. Maybe we reduce benefits so we don't have to spend as much on Social Security. Maybe we increase the retirement age for full benefits. Right now it's 67. Maybe we make it 68, 69. That's kind of a shame, right? Because people want to retire. We might have to raise taxes. And so that will be a conversation we talk about with entitlement programs like Social Security. Do we need to pay more Social Security tax to cover these people? But there's actually a third option, and that is, can we continue to rely on debt, right? Can we just rely more and more on debt, more so than we're doing now? Because we already rely on debt a lot. So can we think about a combination of all three of these things? And that's probably the reality. We need to do some cutting of spending. We might need to raise taxes. And we're probably still going to be deficit spending. It doesn't seem like there's any end in sight to that. But this should be of concern to you guys as the younger generation, right? What is my generation leaving your generation? And guys, when I retire, I want my Social Security. It's not going to be a very good return on the investment, but I've paid into it. I want it. And what you're going to learn later is that you guys are the ones responsible for giving me my checks. There's not a savings account with my money in it. You guys work, you pay taxes, and that money comes to me. And so people like me are going to say, look, we're entitled to these benefits. Make it work. Figure it out. That could mean higher taxes for you guys. So you should be concerned, and you do need to be engaged in this, and you do need to understand as voters and future taxpayers. You're going to have to continue paying that Social Security tax because you're going to have to pay my benefits. But you should be asking, will Social Security benefits still exist for you? Have we created a fiscal nightmare where this is not going to be possible for you guys, where you're going to have to pay the tax but get nothing in return? So you should be concerned. We're going to cover these issues more fully later, Social Security, but that's just one example, right? One example. There are a lot of people that say, look, tax the rich. Let's solve our problems by taxing the rich. So we need to ask the question, can we solve the problems by taxing the rich? Is that going to work? Well, studies say no. Look, we cannot solve our problems by taxing the rich. Now, we might need to or want to tax the rich. We might need or want them to pay more. That's not what I'm saying. I'm simply saying we cannot close the gap. We cannot solve our Social Security problem. We cannot eliminate our deficits. We cannot get our debt way down by taxing the rich more. And I know this is a misconception that's been communicated to you through social media, but it's not true. Because to close the gap, we have to tax the rich at more than 100%. So guys, think about it. What does it mean to tax somebody at more than 100%? It means not only do you have to take away every dollar I make, but then I still owe you tax money, right? And think about it, guys. If you taxed me even at just 100%, if you taxed me at 90%, am I going to continue to work? No. So if you tax the rich at really, really high tax rates, they are not going to do these jobs anymore. They have no incentive. And clearly we can't tax people at more than 100%. That is nonsensical. So guys, the studies are pretty clear. This isn't going to work. And here's just an example. Necessary but not sufficient. Why taxing the wealthy can't fix the deficit. So there are studies out there by good scholars and good researchers and economists that validate that, hey, we might want them to pay more. It doesn't get us out of our fiscal situation. So be clear about that, guys. It doesn't get rid of our current fiscal situation. Also, keep in mind that Americans already do pay a lot of taxes, and we'll talk more about this in our next unit. Now, we don't pay as much as Europeans, and that's true, and a lot of people point that out. They say, hey, look, for Americans, if you compare us to people in Denmark and people in Germany, we pay a lot less taxes than they do, and that is true, but here's the deal. Europeans get more. They pay more taxes, but they get more. What are some of the things that they get paid for by tax dollars? Well, a lot of these countries have free national health care. We don't have free national health care, right? If you have a job that gives you health care, that's great. But we have a lot of people that don't have health care, or they have too little health care. They might have insurance, but it's what we'd call underinsured. It's not sufficient insurance. So if you got national health care, you might be willing to pay more taxes. Another thing that some European nations get is free university education. My friends in Germany got to go to university for free. but there's a trade-off. Not everyone gets to go to university. Some of my friends ended up in a trade because only those who are the best are going to get university education and others are going to be directed into trades. All right. So my point is that we pay a lot of taxes, not as much as Europeans, but Europeans get a little bit more for their money. There is one thing, though, about European countries. They pay more taxes because they redistribute more income. So by redistribute more income, you understand what I mean, right? They're going to have things that channel money from higher income to lower income. So they redistribute more income than we distribute. So clearly one thing we need to understand if we're going to talk about what to do, if we're going to talk about policy and solving some of our problems, we're going to need to understand the basics of taxes, and that will be a topic that we will cover. But don't close out yet because we're not done. We want to ask ourselves one more question, and that is, are we less concerned about debt? Are we less concerned about debt than we used to be? Because we really do sing a slightly different tune. So in a previous lecture, remember, we talked just briefly about the idea that economists think about debt differently now than we used to. It's not quite as scary to have so much public debt. And the reason is that the interest rates that we pay on the debt is very low. It's very low. So guys, just like if you're in a household, if you can get loans at really low interest rates, it might make sense. For example, if you buy a house and you were able to get 3% interest, that was a great deal. Even if you had the cash to pay for the house, just pay it outright without a loan, it might not make sense to do so because that loan is really cheap. If you can invest your money and make more than 3%, but then just have 3% loan interest for what you owe for your house loan, well, it makes sense. Keep the loan at 3%, that's cheap money, and then take the cash and invest it. So it's kind of the same idea that if the interest that we pay on debt is really low, then having debt's not so bad. So if the interest rate stays low, then government debt just isn't as problematic as it used to be. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't be concerned about it. I think we should be. But the good news is that interest has made debt relatively cheap. But here's the thing. Let's loop back around to what we just learned. Data showed that interest will take up a larger and larger percent of government budget, right? That the portion of the government budget that we have to pay for interest is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. So while interest rates are really low for the debt that we have, it will consume a larger and larger share of our federal budget. So that is a concern, right? We can't use our debt to resolve all of our problems. For example, our entitlement program issue. Guys, can we just use debt to bail out Social Security? Yeah, no, that's not a good idea. We shouldn't just rely on debt. So we do need to have some kinds of reforms. We do need to rein it in. So I guess my punchline here is that debt is still a concern, not as much of a concern. And going forward, having cheap loans is good, right? Interest rates being low is good, but we still have questions to ask ourselves. For example, is there excessive government spending? Right? One way to get down our deficits and thus our debt is to reduce government spendings, and we need to take a hard look at that. Is there money that we waste? Is there places where we can and should tighten our belts? Because you don't want to have to pay higher taxes. And if we can decrease our deficits, then you won't have to. But another thing we need to ask is, what if the interest on debt increases? What if the interest on debt increases, right? Our new way of thinking about debt as being not quite so bad is because interest rates are low. And hopefully it stays that way for a long time. But what if it doesn't? What if interest on debt does increase? Well, that could be a concern. So thank you so much, guys. I hope you've taken good notes and learned a lot about government finance. Please let me know if you have any questions on this topic, and otherwise have a fantastic day.